In this presentation, we'll be discussing harmonic sequences. We'll be focusing on defining what sequences are. We'll identify idiomatic aspects of sequences as they are used in the common practice era. We'll analyze several different types of sequences. And we'll also work to interpret other sequences which do not fit into the above categories, including modulatory sequences. So first, let's define what sequences are. Sequences are musical patterns. They typically incorporate the repetition of a motive or figuration at successively higher or lower pitch levels. Sequences could be melodic, where you have a melodic idea that's repeated at a higher or lower step, or harmonic, where you have a harmonic passage that is then repeated at a higher or lower pitch level. Frequently, though, melodic sequences and harmonic sequences are combined and work together. Sequences can also be real, where the intervallic pattern of the sequence is transposed exactly, tonal, where the pattern is moved up or down, but remains in the key, or modulating, which is often a mix of the two. I want to emphasize that sequences are divided into units called legs. There's some other names for these, but we'll use the term leg in this presentation. This consists of one complete iteration of a sequential pattern. The reason I want to emphasize this is that it's easy to become used to thinking of sequences as just a string of harmonies. And what we should actually be doing is focusing on the fact that there's another level of hierarchy above that. There's a larger grouping of how the sequence is organized, and we'll be talking about how it's divided down with legs. Typically, each leg will consist of at least two harmonies, but we will see some sequences today where there are more than two harmonies in a leg. And for a sequence to be considered a sequence, it must have at least two of these legs. If it only had one leg, it would just be a melodic statement. It needs an additional leg at a higher or lower pitch level in order for it to be a sequence. Now, let's identify where the sequence arose from, particularly in the common practice era and the early parts of it. The origin of the sequence lies in the harmonization of stepwise motion. Sequences from the common practice era will almost always demonstrate some element of stepwise motion. In the diagram below, you see the harmonization of a downward stepwise line which culminates in the circle of fifths sequence. So first we have a downward stepwise line, D, C, B, A, G. Now let's imagine that we come up with sort of the simplest harmonization possible, which is just to give it parallel thirds and end on a unison G. We can make it a little bit more interesting by adding a rhythmic offset to create a suspension chain. Now, let's take those two lines that we've created and we'll slowly harmonize those. First, harmonizing the lower voice with thirds. We seem to start having a stronger sense of harmonic motion there. And we can harmonize the upper lines with thirds as well. There, a sequence is revealed. Marked in blue, we have the legs of this sequence going from a 4 major 4/3 chord to a 7 half diminished to a 3/4/3 to a 6/7 to a 2/4/3 to a 5/7 to 1. Or if we highlighted that bass motion down below, here's our 1/7, 4/7, 7 half diminished, 3, 6, 2, and then 5, and then 1. And there we have outlined the circle of fifths sequence, so called because it's made of descending fifths. G down to C, down to F sharp, down to B. Now it's circled around a little bit, so we have some ascending fourths, because otherwise we'd fall off the edge of the piano. But this is the core of this, originating from voice-leading patterns that are harmonizing stepwise motion. And most of the sequences that we'll be looking at today somehow harmonize that stepwise motion. And even when they don't at first, we'll see that they'll be elaborated so that that stepwise motion is always present. Now, one technique that composers would use would be to ornament these basic underlying harmonic patterns. One such example of ornamentation is from the Bach chaconne from the Partita for Solo Violin BWV 1004. Here we have a basic circle of fifths sequence. 1 to 4 to 7 to 3 to 6 to 2. There's a cadential 6/4 implied, and then a 5. And then ultimately it will resolve to 1. And here's what it sounds like all together. Now, that increases, for me, the layers of interest, and it makes it more than just a chord progression. We have ornamentation, we have figuration on top of it. But you'll notice that this chord progression, this sequence, is still ornamenting the stepwise motion, as you can see from the circled notes. So that underlying skeleton is still there, but composers are building on top of it to maintain melodic interest on top of these harmonic sequences. Now, let's talk a little bit about how these legs are treated when we add inversions and sevenths to harmonic sequences. It's perfectly fine to do so. However, it's important to recall that sequences are not just strings of chords, but they're repetitions of legs. They are repetitions of patterns. So if an inversion is included, the same inversion should be included at the same point in each of the legs, because we're trying to create a pattern. The same is true of seventh chords. There are 3 examples here. Each one of them utilizes the chords of a circle of fifths sequence in a major key. Now, in the first example, the one on the left with the first green check mark, we see that there are first inversion chords used. And in this case, each time a first inversion chord appears, it is the second chord of a leg. But that pattern remains the same. It's always the second chord of a leg, and so that's totally idiomatic. The same is true of the second example, the middle one with the second check mark. Here we have seventh chords in first inversion. 1-6-5 to 4, 7 half diminished 6-5 to 3, 6-6-5 to 2, and 5-6-5 to 1. In this case, the seventh chords are in the same inversion and in the same place in each leg. Once again, completely idiomatic in terms of the treatment of inversions and sevenths. But this third example is a bit of a mess. We have seventh chords all over the place, we have inversions all over the place, and they don't create a structured pattern. They don't let us build up the expectation that makes sequences so appealing in common practice era music. So when we're writing them, we'll want to follow those first 2 examples by keeping the inversion or seventh structure identical in each of the legs, rather than what we see in the third example where it changes from leg to leg. Let's talk now about analyzing specific types of sequences. There are several types of sequences that are used in the common practice era, and they're named for aspects of their harmonic progression. It's important to note that other types of sequences are certainly possible. These 4 just represent some of the most common types that you might encounter. The types we'll talk about today are the circle of fifths, the reverse circle of fifths, the sequence by third, also known as the descending 5-6, or just by the nickname the Pachelbel sequence, and the ascending 5-6 sequence, which we'll refer to here also as the down 3, up 4 sequence. Note that when you're using or playing a sequence, part of it or all of it might occur. A composer might curtail it, or they might want to spread it out and use the entire thing. That's absolutely fine either way. Let's begin with one of the most common types of sequences, the circle of fifths sequence. The circle of fifths sequence, which you'll see me sometimes abbreviate as CO5, is named for the root motion between each of its harmonies. This is by far the most common sequence in the common practice era. It involves each harmony moving downwards by a fifth or ascending by fourth. That will mix up so that we don't run out of room on the keyboard. In major, the sequence goes like this: 1 to 4 to 7 to 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 and to 1. Note that, as we've seen before, sevenths and inversions can of course be added. But it's also important to be aware of the fact that there's a progression in here that's a little bit less common, the 7 diminished to 3 progression. We don't see that as much outside of sequences. That's because the patterning of sequences helps the ear gloss over progressions or other melodic or harmonic aspects that might be a little bit less idiomatic outside of a sequence's context. But because a sequence plays on the ear's desire for expectation, it allows for these less idiomatic progressions to be glossed over. In minor, the sequence proceeds like this: minor 1 to minor 4. We then go to major 7, or flat major 7, if you use that terminology, to 3, and then 6, and then 2 diminished to 5, and then to 1. Note that the leading tone is not used until the end of the sequence. That's why we have that flat 7 earlier on. We are not approaching the cadence yet, and so we don't need to have that raised leading tone. Again, note that we have a slightly less common progression there, the use of that flat 7 to 3. And again, that's part of the sequence's patterning, allowing the ear to just gloss over that less common progression. Sevenths and inversions can be freely added in the minor mode as well. And as we noted, the mid part of the sequence utilizes the natural minor scale, thus the use of major 7. The reverse circle of fifths is also named for the root motion between each of its harmonies. However, it proceeds backwards when compared with the normal circle of fifths. It descends by fourth and ascends by fifth. It's much less common than its relative, the normal circle of fifths, because it utilizes numerous retrogressions, harmonic successions that move in the reverse direction of the usual types of harmonic progressions. You'll likely recognize this from the very outset when we listen to the major mode version of this sequence, going from 1 to 5 to 2 to 6 to 3 to 7 diminished to 4 to 1. From the very first few chords, we hear that we're moving backwards. That 5 that we want to proceed to a tonic class chord instead moves to a predominant class chord. And in minor, it will likewise sound a little bit out of place, going from 1 to minor 5 to 2 diminished to 6 to 3 to 7 to 4 to 1. A lot of progressions in there that don't sound quite like the tonal forward motion that we're expecting in common practice era music. You can certainly add sevenths and inversions in either major or minor, but recall, as always, that they should appear in the same relative location in each leg. Let's look at another type of sequence that uses a different interval to create its harmonic motion, the sequence by third. Sequences by third evolved from a series of chords related by root motion by downward third. In the first measure in the example below, it's Clara Schumann's Easy Preludes for Students, number 1, we see one such series of chords connected by root motion by third, going from 1 to 6 to 4 to 2. This sets up a nice little sequential sound. We should also notice that Schumann elaborates this sequence in the second and third measures. Here, the bass line from the first measure is transferred to the uppermost voice, the C in the bass on the first beat to the C in the uppermost voice on the third beat of the second measure, the A to the downbeat of the third measure, the F to the third beat of the third measure, and the D to the fourth beat of the third measure. Then Schumann also uses chromatic chords to elaborate those notes that were transferred up to the uppermost line. 7 diminished 7 of 6 to 6. 5 7 of 6, deceptively resolving to 4. 7 fully diminished 7 of 2, resolving to 2. This creates pairs of harmonies, which result in the legs of a sequence. It's worth noting that not all of these legs of the sequence are exactly sequenced down. with the same functions of harmonies. The second leg, for instance, in the chromatic elaboration, uses a secondary dominant rather than a secondary diminished seventh chord. Be that as it may, it still seems evident that Clara Schumann is working here to create chromatic elaborations of a sequence by thirds, even though it's slightly altered. We'll have that sometimes in sequences. So it's actually more common to see this elaborated version of the sequence by thirds, not always with this degree of chromaticism, as we'll soon find out, but at least with some chord intervening between the third to third motion. So it's less common to see 1, 6, 4, and 2 used for the sake of a sequence, and rather it's more common to see chords intervening between those. So it's less common to see the sequence by third as chord-to-chord motion. It's much more common to see it as leg-to-leg motion. The sequence by third has another name, the descending 5-6 sequence. We'll explore this by looking at Ludwig van Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 30 in E major below, which sounds like this in the opening of the first movement. Note the sequential legs, 1 going to 5-6, 6 going to 3-6, and 4 going to 1-6, before we have an imperfect authentic cadence. Here, Beethoven utilizes a common treatment of the sequence by third, alternating between root position chords and first inversion chords. So first, let's notice that the motion from leg to leg is where we get that third motion, from 1 to 6 to 4, and then that third motion is connected by these first inversion chords, the 5-6, the 3-6, and the 1-6. Note the circled notes that I've put here, which display the stepwise motion, that stepwise motion that this sequence is elaborating. Before we cadence. It's because of the common treatment of the root position chord to the first inversion chord that the sequence by third is sometimes known as the descending 5-6 sequence when it appears like this. This is due to the fact that the bass is descending and that the figured bass numbers create this 5-6 pattern. A root position chord with the implied 5 of the figured bass and a first inversion chord with the 6 in the figured bass. And again, note that the motion by third is apparent from leg to leg rather than chord to chord, and that the pattern of inversions is the same in each leg. The pattern that we've established from the very beginning, that we want to see the same inversions at the same point in each leg of the sequence. You'll also know this progression from the Pachelbel canon. So we hear that as 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 1. That was, in fact, the root position version of those chords that we just heard in the Beethoven. And as I mentioned, likely most recognizable as Pachelbel's canon in D. Again, note that the third relationship occurs leg to leg. 1 to 6 to 4 before we cadence. And note also that we still have stepwise motion being ornamented. The circled notes are those stepwise motion notes. With the exception of the reverse circle of fifths, the sequences we've observed so far have all been descending sequences. Ascending sequences are slightly less common than descending ones, but one which occurs regularly is the ascending 5-6 sequence. Similar to the descending 5-6 sequence, this sequence gets its name first from the motion of the bass voice, in this case it goes upwards, and the figured bass numbers, which again create a 5-6 pattern. A root position chord with its implication of 5, and a first inversion chord, which with its implication of 6 in the figured bass. In the example below, which is the Gigue fugue, which is attributed to J.S. Bach, note the stepwise ascent of the bass voice from leg to leg, as well as the presence of the inversion in the same relative position in each leg. It sounds like this. First, we have a 1-6 chord, and then our sequence begins, outlined below, with the dotted lines, a 4 going to a 2-6. So there's our root position chord going to a first inversion chord. Then a 5 going to a 3-6, and then a 6 going to a 4-6. So there is this stepwise sequence that is ascending, creating this pattern of a root position chord to a first inversion chord, or this ascending 5-6 sequence. And in each of those legs, note that the lowest note of the pedal, or the bass voice, creates a stepwise ascent. C to D to E. In fact, you can see that interval of a fifth to the interval of a sixth if you compare that pedal voice, the lowest note of the pedal, with the lower note of the right hand. So we start with a C and a G, and then we go to a C and an A, then a D and an A, and a D and a B, an E and a B, and an E and a C. So we have that ascent of 5 to 6, 5 to 6. And the composer here, whether it's Bach or someone else, then interpolated a circle of fifth sequence after that. Before bringing us to a close. Because this sequence can also occur with root position chords or with other inversions, it is sometimes useful to simply refer to it by its root motion, i.e. down 3, up 4, or down a third, up a fourth. This is what we see in the Gigue fugue example. If we start with the first leg of the ascending stepwise sequence, we have a 4, going down a third in terms of root motion to a 2, then going up a fourth in terms of root motion to a 5. If we played this version of the sequence out in major, it would go 1 to 6-6 to 2 to 7 diminished 6 to 3 to 1-6 to 4 to 2-6 to 5 to 3-6 to 6 to 4-6 to 7 diminished to 5-6 to 1. That's lengthier than any of the other sequences we've looked at so far, and therefore typically only a portion of it is used, as we see below. There are some examples where the metrical accent of this pattern is switched. That creates an up 4, down 3 sequence. So rather than down 3, up 4, we just switch that patterning in terms of the meter. This sounds like this. 1 going up to 4, going down a third to 2, up a fourth to 5, down a third to 3, up a fourth to 6, down a third to 4, up a fourth to 7 diminished, down a third to 5, and up a fourth to 1. One example of this is in Meredith Willson's musical The Music Man, where Marian the librarian is bemoaning the cultural state of River City. As long as the Madison Public Library was entrusted to me for the purpose of improving River City's cultural level, and she goes on and states this. But in this case, Willson is purposefully using these sequences to build up the energy that this conversation is having in terms of complaining about the people of River City and Marianne's mother presenting a completely contrary point to what Marianne is talking about. Other types of sequences are certainly possible as well, but they'll typically build on patterns that we've seen from earlier types. Below is a portion of Mariana Martinez's Sonata in A major. This passage begins in F sharp minor. If you're not familiar with Martinez's works, I highly recommend checking them out. She's a contemporary of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Franz Joseph Haydn, and she's got a wonderful array of chamber works, piano works, and works for orchestra and chorus. If you're a fan of high classical repertoire, definitely consider adding some of her works to the works that you're playing. First, we should note the legs of the sequence, which begin in the first full measure. Each leg is 2 beats long, with the third leg being slightly altered to bring about a cadence. This is a very common occurrence where we have 2 legs that move in relatively lockstep fashion, with the last leg being slightly changed. It gives a sense of variety and a nice rule of 3 aesthetic. Second, note that each leg displays downwards motion, elaborating a stepwise descent. So we start with a D as the highest note in the first leg, then a C sharp, then a B. Next, we can analyze with Roman numerals, but let's go ahead and take a listen to this so we can contextualize that orally. So we start with 7 diminished 6, going to 1 6, then a 1 4, 1 6, flat 7 6, add a 7th, 3, 7 6, 6 6, add a 7, 2 diminished, 6 6, 5 6, 5 7, 1. Pardon my wrong note there. This reveals that each leg actually contains 3 harmonies, with the last even having an inversion change in the addition of a 7th, rather than the standard 2 we've seen before. However, even in this case where we've added in extra harmonies, we still have the same pattern of inversions and 7ths retained leg to leg. Root, first inversion, 7. Root, first inversion, 7. Root, first inversion, 7, and then cadence. Now, we can also note that the middle harmony of each leg seems more embellishing than structural. Note how the lower notes provide a stepwise link, like passing tones to the third harmony. So in the first leg, the lower notes, that B, D to A, C sharp to G sharp, B, that 1 6 chord acting like passing tones to the third chord. So if we take out that less structural harmony, we see a circle of fifth sequence. 4 going to 7, then 3 going to 6, then 2 diminished going to 5. This demonstrates the underlying sequential structure that Martinez was building upon, even though she was adding in extra harmonies and extra inversions beyond those what we were expecting. Martinez uses a similar technique in the middle of the same sonata. This section also begins in F sharp minor. Here the legs of the sequence are each a bar long, and the sequence alters in the third statement as we've seen before. Note that the second and third legs are a step lower than the previous statement, again elaborating a stepwise descent. We begin the first leg with an E sharp, the second leg with a D sharp, and the third leg with a C sharp. It's also worth noting that Martinez uses a real sequence in the melodic line. That is, in each subsequent leg after the first, she transposes the right hand down exactly 1 whole step, thus leaving the key of F sharp minor and creating a modulation. The other sequences we've seen thus far have all been tonal sequences. That's why we haven't left the keys that we've been in. We can see this in detail by performing a Roman numeral analysis, which again reveals a circle of fifth sequence when we move from strong beat to strong beat. Let's take a listen. Pardon my stray G natural there. So we begin in F sharp minor with a 5 chord, which has some stepwise motion, going to a 5 6, and then a 5 7, and then a 1. Then we tonicize flat 7, with flat 7 acting as 5 in the key of A major, and now we're back in A. And then we tonicize 4 with a 5 7 of 4. Now, in this case, each of these legs again has multiple harmonies. We have a 5 chord in the first leg, a 6 half diminished 7, a 5/6, and then a 5/7 before moving to 1. However, like we saw in the previous example, that second harmony in each leg is actually elaborating the motion. It's just acting like passing tones, elaborating that 5 chord. So if we gloss over that second triplet beat in each of the legs, we see that we actually have a circle of fifth sequence. C sharp major going to F sharp minor, then B with a seventh going to E, then A going to D. Again, even though this is a complex sequence we're modulating, there's a real sequence in the melody. We have multiple chords in each leg. We see that Martinez is building up from some of the basic building blocks of what makes a sequence, elaborating a stepwise descent, and even basing it on one of the most common types of sequences, the circle of fifth sequence. To review what we've learned today, in this tutorial we learned that sequences are musical patterns that typically ornament stepwise motion. We learned that these sequences are grouped into legs, typically consisting of 2 harmonies, that a sequence will have at least 2 legs, and that sevenths and inversions appear in the same relative place in each leg. We learned several types of sequences, including the circle of fifths, the reverse circle of fifths, the sequence by thirds, which I've also deemed the Pachelbel or descending 5/6 sequence, and the ascending 5/6 sequence, which I've referred to as the down 3 up 4 sequence. We also looked at some special cases of sequences that used more than 2 harmonies per leg, as well as a chromatic modulating sequence. You should now be ready to begin analyzing sequences in repertoire you study and perform, as well as compose these sequences in pieces you write or arrange.